Prototype has reached episode 18. That does not mean it's legal. It's actually only a year old or something. But at least it's a big number. The welcome wagon is going to be the subject of discussion here. We're going to be talking about player onboarding and, some campaign planning. All of these concepts dovetail with each other. And we're even going to be talking about visuals and configuration files and all this other stuff. So obviously centered around Cosmonic Brood War, but pretty easy to extrapolate that out of not just in the discussion of the most ambitious Brood War mod ever made, but also the discussion of RTS content, real-time strategy content in general. I suppose we can start our subjects off specifically with visual replacements, something that I think is important to note when you're working on a conversion, a mod, or an overhaul, or whatever Cosmonic Brood War is to you. Generally speaking, there are some custom replacements that we have for existing units, right? The Phalanx has been remodeled. That's the Terran siege tank. The Anchor, the Terran bunker, that's been remodeled and replaced as well. Of course, the Diadem, right? The ion cannon, actually being a unit in the game that you can build. Yeah, that's also pretty big, so that's another remodel. And, we also have the Fulcrum and the Palladium. Those are the factory and machine shop, for those of you not aware of our naming conventions. And generally speaking, we're having this slow march of replacing the original stuff. We also have the Wraith from Solstice, the Panoptis instead of the Scout for the Protoss, as well as the Scribe instead of the Probe. So the reason why it's significant to have these visual replacements that are coming in and subsuming other stuff, right? We're talking about an instance where we have an original graphic, a vanilla graphic, that it no longer, is represented by the OG art. It actually underscores the idea that something might be different about how this unit operates. Something might be, different in terms of its power, or maybe even in terms of its role. And there's loads of cases where that is not actually represented. We're thinking of things like the Cleric and the Seraph. Those are the Medic and the Science Vessel. These are cases where, the unit role is a bit different. The Seraph is completely different than the Science Vessel, for example, but it still has the old model. So I would, at some point, like to make that a little bit more, different, right? And having source control over the models also allows us to maybe take it in a different direction, right? The Wraith has very different, general silhouettes, right? We removed the third blaster and removed any semblance of it having missile pods, although I don't really think those were well represented anyway in the original graphic. And we made it entirely about the burst lasers, right? And that's actually an improvement because now we have something that more accurately represents the new role and the new aspects of the unit, as opposed to the vanilla concept. And I think that it's really important to get as many of those done as possible, not just because, for the Terran structures that didn't have the landing pads, we can add landing pads to them. That's obviously one example where, the Anchor is clearly improved by that. But also just in general being able to say, hey, we have our own assets, it immediately indicates to the player that is used to the original assets that there's something different about this. And, there's a lot of other things that I would like to adjust anyway. If I had my way, I would have completely custom assets for every vanilla graphic. We would replace them all. Not just because, some of them are different, but also because some of them have real obvious flaws. The Maverick is just flipping back and forth between, which hand is its weapon hand, which facing angle has the gun, right? That's just because they don't have omnidirectional sprites. Well, we have the support in the game to render omnidirectionally, so we don't have to be limited by that angle. We can actually make it so that they're omni. And that makes sense, right? Now we can have all 32 facing angles instead of just mirroring them when they're facing left, as opposed to, actually having left-facing frames in the game. That's one example where clearly we have the better situation, so we should probably try to replace all of these assets. But, that's not really related to player onboarding. However, since every unit does operate a little bit differently, and since every unit does have a little bit of a, divergence in terms of its power budget, I think it would make sense for us to adjust all of the graphics, particularly focusing on the ones that do have significant deviations from the OG situation. The fact that the Terran structures can all lift off now, except for add-ons, that's a pretty key case. The fact that our production facilities for the barracks, which is now the stockade, the Fulcrum I already mentioned, and of course the starport, these are different sizes now. Well, that should probably be reflected in their, general design, and that's what we had with the Fulcrum and the Palladium. We eventually need that for the stockade and the Covenant, which is the covert ops, as well as, of course, the vestry. We need something like that to be applied for all of the different cases, and we don't have source control for new models everywhere, right? DF is working on a couple of them. Dark and Fantasies, he's one of the guys who's done the most art for the buildings in particular. He's the one who's responsible for remodeling a lot of the classic stuff and trying to be faithful to it, whereas Solstice has come in and, remodeled, fixing the fact that the scout graphic was actually rendered with perspective on, so its thrusters and its nose would change size depending on which facing angle it was in. So we got an orthographic render out instead for that, and then on top of it, managed to successfully change up the shape of that model in the same way that the Wraith was changed, right? But in cases where the unit is relatively similar, still being able to say that this is our source model for it can allow us to account for even the subtle differences. Like building space is not, it's a pretty big deal in the grand scheme of things, I guess, but it's not as big as, for example, the Seraph now no longer having EMP, instead just having Irradiate be completely different, and being able to paint nuclear strikes. Like, all of that plus the Observance passive, it's all pretty big, right? Like, we want to actually signify that. We would probably ideally like to signify detection in general, right? Like, here's a unit that has detection. Well, it does something specific. It has some sort of read associated with it that implies that detection. I tried to do that with the Shaman. You can argue whether or not it was successful. That sprite does need to be revised at some point anyway. But, these are cases where it's like, if we have a custom asset for it, we should probably try to do our best to indicate certain aspects of its passive. I think that makes sense. I think that is appropriate. Now, that all being said, the visual replacements will eventually arrive for everything that we really need, especially, but probably in general, like one of the things I was commenting on earlier today, this is the 8th of August, for those wondering, Tuesday. It is about 3 in the afternoon, because 3. And we are talking about the Zethracore here. I was talking about that on the Discord server, and how the Zethracore, our name for the Zergling, is pretty much entirely player color in 161. We obviously don't use the remastered graphics, but you think about the cases where we're dealing with, here's a Zerg unit. Like, you kind of want to be able to tell that it's Zerg, and you can't really tell what the Zethracore actually is, because there's not really any coloration associated with it or any design associated with it that is really that quite so Zergy. I would argue that the Quasilisk and the Nathracore, which have recently received custom graphics from Solstice, look a lot more Zergy than the Zethracore does, because they actually have details you can pick out. And the Zethracore is, again, mostly player color, so there aren't really any fine details you could pick out from it, since it's all washed away with player color. Now, does that mean that we should not have that much player color on Zerg models? Well, no, that's definitely not the case. You have to, have some sort of nuance with how you correct this, but that would be an example of improving it. I think the Hurakan is another example where the Firebat, a lot of the details on that graphic are kind of muddied and washed together. There's a bunch of cases like that. The Goliath is actually still rendered with perspective the same way that the Scout graphic was, and so when we remade the Panoptus, that made sense for Solstice to fix that. Obviously, we're not going to try to be faithful to that, but the Goliath is actually the same way, and so making it look more like a conventional thing, it does mean that you'll have a more consistent appreciation for the graphics which were designed that way, right? Which were handled that way. When you look at something in that context, you're looking at it in the context of how does it fit in with the other graphics in the race? Well, if it has the wrong angle with how it was rendered, that's going to make it really, really quite difficult to make sense of. Now, buildings do pose a challenge. DF is actually the only one who's been able to make good-looking building graphics within CMBW thus far. I am not really sure how to emulate his exact approach, because he uses 3ds Max, and I don't want to have him switch to Blender, because that's going to be a whole nightmare. I don't even know if he would do it, but I wouldn't even recommend it, because he's very accustomed to that workflow. However, I use Blender, Solstice uses Blender, Balethal uses Blender, everybody uses Blender, so it's a little bit hard to adapt his scene. In theory, it should be that just oh, well, let's just grab the camera angles and stuff. But we have the camera angles, and somehow ours just don't look as good. So I don't know if it's something specific to how he designs the meshes that we need to adapt, something specific to his design process, as opposed to some more scene-related material, oh, hey, here's this data about the camera, and here's this data about the render, how we output the graphics or whatever. Maybe it's just I'm doing it wrong when I try to do it. Who knows? Either way, though, it's something that we want to crack so that we can replace things like, I was musing today that the quarry for the Terrans is probably the biggest eyesore of the bunch. It's a little bit too big for an add-on, so it extends past its boundaries as far as its collision size is concerned. And then it's a little too noisy and like palette messed up. It's actually rendered from a different palette because it's from a different game. So, it's not great. I've done some cleanup on it, but it's really not great. So eventually replacing that with something that doesn't look total ass would be nice. And then I think probably the next highest priority remodel is probably the treasury, actually, because that's a case where we want something that's just as big as the ministry in terms of building space. The treasury is actually bigger in terms of pure size, similar to the quarry being a little bit too big. And the treasury also, doesn't immediately, at least to me, say, hey, I'm a town center. Although I'm not really sure how you would do that exactly, but we could build in some idea of like, here's a stockpile, here's like a mining bay or something where you like drop the resources off to, and who knows like what else we might be able to do, right? And if we could indicate that it's actually less armored than the ministry, which is our name for the command center, by the way, that would help a lot because it is less armored, but it actually looks bigger, and therefore it's a little bit confusing, especially to new players, I imagine, where, because these graphics were made for some other purpose and we're repurposing them, as a result, it definitely is in a weird spot, right? Like we need to consider, hey, here's how we're going to wrangle the, a couple of the graphics from, here's how we're going to wrangle these graphics such that they actually represent what the unit is. And it sounds silly to say, it sounds like obvious to say, but that's just something that happens the longer and the more consistently that we're able to get some work done on these graphics and replace them, be they placeholders or OG graphics indeed. And again, the significance of the OG ones being replaced is because they don't do the same things as they used to do. And of course, because they also have some flaws that we would like to correct. And it's not just about, visual quality isn't good. Like, that is a concern, for sure, particularly with Zerg units, and probably with all structures for all races, to be honest. There's like a couple of them, like the Matrix for Protoss, for example, that's definitely in need of replacements. But the visual quality is actually secondary to indicating what the thing does and not making a false promise to the player about like how durable a thing is, or basically setting correct expectations, making sure that the raw visceral experience you get from looking at the unit or the structure is in line with what what the actual result is of using that unit or attacking that unit or whatever. So that seems to me like the most important thing. And that's obviously related to player onboarding in a very visceral way, right? It's what the player sees, and obviously for sound cues, what they hear. You don't want sounds that are really, really powerful being played for like a basic attack like a Maverick, for example, our name for the Marine. You don't want something like that, because then you're in a situation where suddenly you have this weird expectation, like, I thought the gun would be doing more damage because it sounds really boomy and bassy, but in fact it's actually just dealing like 5 or 6 damage or whatever, and that's a weird situation to be in. So be that as it may, it's definitely something to keep in mind as we continue to improve the audio visuals, but particularly the visuals of the project. It's something we are working on, right? As you've seen, if you've been following development most recently, we're slowly and surely replacing a lot of the graphics from the Zerg. Actually, it hasn't even really been that slow, although Solstice is taking about a week off. But beyond that, we are going to be in a situation where pretty soon we have, a completed, tier 1 and tier 2, like Quasrock Leveril set, which is the Zethercore, Vorvercore, which needs a graphic, and then the Nathercore, the Calculus needs a graphic. Obviously, the Zethercore does need like a replacement eventually, but it's not like strictly required yet. The Vorvercore being more divergent would be nice. If we make a Vorvercore, we probably want to make the Zethercore first anyway, so that we have something to work off of. The Calculus is the big one. Once that's done, then we're in business as far as like, immediately readable graphics that are clearly distinct from other games, but also clearly, proper as far as, being of the same sort of branch of the tech tree. Like, you kind of want the graphics to look that way. Now, the Leveril Pond graphic as a building could definitely be improved. I'm not really 100% sure what we would do about that. It might be worth it just to like kit bash the base structure in all of the cases, instead of being like, here's my, here's my graphic that I ripped from some other source, or even like the Gorgorl Swamp graphic, which obviously that structure actually needs a rename since the Gorgor Core is no longer associated with it. The Gorgorl Swamp graphic is, funnily enough, obviously like the Overmind Cocoon graphic from original Brood War. Like, that's a situation where I think, despite the fact that it has player color, I think courtesy of DF did that. it's still not great for it to just be like a graphic from the game that has been repurposed, right? We would want something custom. And so maybe it's worth it to just kit bash some shit just for the sake of like being consistent, a little bit more consistent than, you know, the visuals of like, you know, some other game being here or some other structure that some people in the player base will have other associations with. Like, we don't really want to be muddying associations with, you know, here's the original game's graphics, but they're used in like a weird tech center way where it's like not really what we would expect at all. Because then you have to build this, you have to forge this new association over an existing one instead of just being like, here's a new graphic. So I think that's going to help out a lot when we do get new graphics in, and, you know, some musing on what we might be able to do in short term. But that's the initial blurb on, you know, the visual replacement angle. And it is something that is very important. Obviously, it's very heartening for me to see the project get fleshed out with additional graphics. And even though obviously it's not my work in particular, like, you know, a lot of the times it was me picking graphics from other sources, and then those placeholder graphics from other games or whatever are then used as like reference material with some consultation by myself to build out the new work. So there is some element of my vision there, and maybe some of it's a little bit muddied because like you're kind of taking the existing graphics from the OG game and then saying like, what would it look like if the Zethracore could fly or something, you know, like, and then you're trying to build out the Nathracore out of that. Plus you're comparing it to the Five Nations graphic that it originally came from for the placeholder. Plus then you're also like filtering in any feedback I might have in the design process. So what I'm saying is it's not like I'm even making the model to begin with, let alone like being the sole source of artistic input. But I'm not even really, you know, in need of that. What I'm getting at here is that it's actually quite, I would say, compelling to me that people like Solstice are actually invested enough in the project to build out better graphics for it to the point where, you know, their handiwork is all over it. And then they are also able to see like, oh, I made a significant difference in improving this project as far as the visuals go. Plus, you know, just making the project more presentable and more complete. So let's talk about the recommended versus classic config. This is something that came up today as well, and I think it is very intrinsic towards player onboarding. Something that I have been struggling with for a little bit is I'm adding all of these config options, and it's really unwieldy to have to open up a text file to configure that, and then you can't open that text file while the game's launched, and if you make changes to it while the game's launched, then it won't work, it'll reset, and then you have to like, so you have to edit the config while you're like, before you launch the game, and most people aren't going to bother looking at that. And that, in fact, our installation process makes a shortcut so that they don't need to go into the folder to click the exe, which was an attempt at us for making it a little bit more idiot-proof for those who, you know, don't know to run executable files or whatever. Although at that point, I don't know, man. I'm not really too worried about it. It's a little bit convenient, you know, to have a shortcut there. Obviously, it's not my use case, so I can't reflect or relate to it. However, there are things that I think are undoubtedly improvements to the general approach. You know, you have stuff like the grid hotkeys, the order lines, the, you know, certain other things, right? There'd be like recommended settings, which, you know, for anybody who's just starting out and maybe isn't immediately like thinking, oh, this is going to be like StarCraft 1, you know, having a recommended setting which diverges from a classic config, that would probably help to set expectations even in that sense, like a subtle way, like, hey, we recommend you use settings which are completely divergent from the base game. And, you know, that might be a way to say, hey, by the way, this game is also very divergent from the base game. Like what you're playing right now is not going to be the same as StarCraft 1. So, you know, a lot of this is I meant to mention this earlier. I should mention that Mr. Z, who's a community member of the Discord server and actually a game designer himself, recently tried the project for the first time in a while, and he was very surprised that, you know, about how some of the pacing worked. And, you know, he had the typical sort of reaction, which I always find kind of amusing, where you're in situations where it's like, here's my, you know, I've played the game for 10 minutes, and I think all of these things must be true. It's like, well, you played the game for 10 minutes, so I don't know about that. But, you know, he had some feedback and he had some impressions, I guess would be the better way to put it. Because I don't think he was actually making statements about it. It was more so like, it seems like this. And then, you know, I'd have to come in and say like, well, not sure if that actually is the case, but, you know, it's a thing. The reason why that's significant anyway is because he's a game designer and because he's made tutorials before, presumably, but also just, you know, he's played a lot of games. He's actively making a game right now. He's working on a game that is playable and played by a number of people. So he's got some experience with this department. As far as player onboarding is concerned, you know, he had some suggestions or some ideas, again, just like impressions about what he thought could work or potentially would help. And, you know, he said that it definitely needs a tutorial, which is funny. funny because we're obviously working on that. So maybe if he had tried the project in like a week or something, it would have been out and he would have been able to check it out. But anyway, I digress. A lot of these considerations are, it comes across from like, hey, I've been working on the tutorial and I've been writing a Substack article about tutorials. And on top of that, I'm working on, trying to spread the word about the project, and it would be really helpful if we had a tutorial so that I could point that out. However, obviously we don't yet have it completed, and then this guy comes in and he's, a game designer, and he, seems to actually think about what he says. And so it's significant in that, here's a game designer trying my project, and he says it probably needs a tutorial. It's like, yeah, no kidding. So how can I think about, ways to improve things? Another thing that he said was, it felt a little deceptive how it looks like StarCraft 1 in many ways, but it still doesn't play at all like it. And that got me thinking, well, maybe that we could do other visual replacements, like replacing the mineral fields, for example, and the Vespene geysers and stuff more. We actually do have custom graphics for the geyser every single place it's at, but we don't have really anything to indicate that it's significantly different. We have basically like reskinning it per tile set, but we don't really have anything that's like indicating that the workers can harvest it without needing to do anything, right? So if you just come from StarCraft 1, you might think, I got to cap my geysers and then I can harvest it. Whereas actually you can't cap your geysers until tier 2. And if you're Protoss, you don't want to cap your geysers super early. So having some idea of like what exactly does that mean is pretty significant actually. So anyway, this is interesting stuff for me as a designer, because I'm thinking to myself, like, how can I go about the approach where I indicate to the players that something is different about things which really are very core to the original game, like resource harvesting and such. I'm not really sure if you can ever realistically, like, elegantly present information about things like worker saturation, for example. I definitely don't want just floating text like the StarCraft 2. That's really just takes me out of the game entirely. And it's also a little bit harder to like say, when you have that floating text, usually what ends up happening is people think I must saturate at all costs. But particularly in the early game and particularly in PvP, you might not want to saturate at any cost. That might not be something that you need to worry about. But, there might be some UI-related things that we can work on that might help to mitigate these issues. It's just something that I've been thinking about personally, is like, how might I work on, improving that sort of thing, and particularly just, communicating the core concepts of the game. And the configuration files are one such thing. There's certain aspects of it that do make the game a little bit easier, a little bit more appropriate, right? Now, there are a couple of things that obviously we still need to fix about the config. Like one of them is being the order lines on the rally points when you task onto like a worker, for example, that's scouting you, and then the worker leaves your vision, it just still follows the unit. And that's become a lot more prominent now that I've made rally lines a default and a separate config option entirely. That was actually courtesy of DF requesting it. So when we're in that kind of territory, there's like things we have to fix about these options. But assuming a world where those are resolved and there are no concerns about that, realistically speaking, I think the recommended config would definitely be the default. And, when you first launch the game, again, thinking ideally here, when we have like loads of options and, we have like full support for like a custom menu and stuff, which is unfortunately very arduous work. Although I think X405 says he's in a pretty good spot for, adding in a bunch of stuff like that. So we'll see. But the classic config would be something that it would say like, hey, we've defaulted you to the recommended config. But if you want the classic config for a similar control scheme to StarCraft 1, then you can click that option or something, and then like gives you a one-time chance to change it. Because, defaults are something that, realistically speaking, it's something that I think 99% of players, or maybe it's closer to like 90% of players, don't edit their settings at all. Probably depends on the kind of game. Maybe RTS games, because they're a little bit more old school, and particularly mods for games. Like, there's probably a little bit more of like a power user vibe to even installing it. But I still think like maybe it's like, even if it was 50% of people just use whatever is recommended, like, that's probably going to be enough for it to be worth it, because they're going to learn grid hotkeys and they're going to learn, quick casting. That's another thing, is like, I don't actually know if quick casting would even be a recommended option. Like, I recommend it because I'm a power user in that sense, if you want to call it that. Like, I intend to play well. I'm actually opening up the config right now to take a look at some of these options. Like, I don't know. Like, would I want you to see order lines, for example? Like, maybe they would be default. Maybe aura circles would be default. Maybe the obviously like APM and stuff would be default. Some of the team UI stuff would be configured just as the standard defaults. Probably, I don't think that would change. Like, recommended versus the differences between recommended and classic would really just be related to like order lines, I guess the quick casting and quick building, and then obviously grid hotkeys. So I don't know. Like that's something to me that I'm not 100% sure about. So hopefully that's something that we can get some input on, actually, because that's something that I think is significant. And of course, I guess recommended would also default your advisor to Mesk, because why not? Still working on that, by the way. That's going to be very funny. So we're talking about config. That's like a little bit more of an open question as to like which options do you guys think would be valuable. Maybe there's some options that we don't have in there that we should have. But in general, like being able to say, hey, I've got these options. Here's the recommended config versus the classic one. You know, maybe we can do some early draft version of that where, you know, you set in the game somewhere that your config is recommended instead of, you know, classic and that sort of thing. And that can be like one of the first pushes in that direction. That being said, I think if people, you know, particularly with quick casting and quick, targeting for quick building, I guess, like quick ordering, right? I think quick targeting was the best way to put it, you know, in terms of it actually being correct. I just use quick casting because that's like usual for the MOBA crowd. This is a case where like, I think trying to play an RTS without that is really stupid now. It just feels very, very snappy, and I'm able to be pretty precise with it overall. The only thing that sometimes gets me is like building placement and stuff, but you know that's usually when I'm like really trying to rush something, and I just need to be a little bit more precise. That's like a player skill issue as opposed to, hey, the UI isn't working, or the UX or whatever. But when I say that, I should remind people that like there's probably going to be a good number of people who think maybe the game is just bugged if that's a default option, and I would really hate for them to think that. And then like quit the game and never play again or something because they're like, well, I'll play when they fix that. Meanwhile, they just didn't even know it was like a config thing. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe as part of the tutorial, like when you first start to play the game, we could mention that, but that feels like it would interrupt the flow of things quite a bit. So I don't know, like maybe what we would actually need is some kind of walkthrough for each option where like it takes you to like choosing certain things. Like instead of recommended versus classic as like a one-time like single option, like that could be the simplified version. But if you want an advanced look, it would be like, do you want quick casting, you know, quick targeting and quick building, and then like give you a demonstration of what it does. You know, I think that could be like just, you know, pointing to the video that we actually made. I made a video about this, you know, in the CMBW features playlist. You know, that's like one case where I think that's a pretty obvious situation where that's a good thing, you know. So anyhow, that's definitely something that I'm thinking about. That's definitely something that I think is significant as far as, you know, generally approaching certain things like new players being aware of certain settings at all. That would be nice if it was in the menu instead of in an obscure like YML file. Yeah, that would probably help quite a bit. So, you know, that's the config talk. And now we get to move on to the next big one. I think, realistically speaking, tutorials and campaigns should teach the core concepts of the game. The obvious point here being that I actually am somebody who believes that playing the content in the campaigns should prepare you for multiplayer. Not necessarily in the sense that the tech trees have to be the exact same or that the enemies have to be the exact same and like play like actual players in that context. There's a lot of straw men around that position. And maybe it's for good reason. Like maybe some people do think that actually every campaign mission should be a 1v1 or a 2v2 or like fair fights and no FFAs at all and, you know, fairly standard play and like the maps should be symmetrical and all that stuff. Like I don't think any of that. I think you can have asymmetric teams. You can have AI arriving in the middle of the battle. You can have setups where the, you know, campaign has different situations occur depending on maybe like previous things that you did, which is totally asymmetric to like, or inconsistent, incongruent with how melee gameplay works. You know, there's loads of things that you could do that I think are totally unique and potentially possibly quite positive for the experience, for telling a story, for communicating ideas to the player, but also still teaching the core concepts of the game, because there's going to be loads of cases where, you know, you could look to any sort of training regimen where a lot of players will do things in professional contexts that have nothing to do with playing the original game, right? The way that you actually learn is by practicing a bunch of things. So you imagine you would practice like Mutalisk Micro in a UMS map, or you would practice, you know, general army control by playing a lot of 2v2s because you get to fight more skirmishes and you get to like see a lot more unit interactions. You get to really internalize how a lot of unit interactions would go and how a lot of fights could be controlled better by basically playing a lot of those. And, even the people who play fastest maps, as much as I think that's a fucking meme and weird thing, those are cases where you can pretty easily look at that and say to yourself, oh, hey, these guys are actually, like practicing spam, keeping their money low. And yeah, okay, it's a spam fest. But even though it doesn't take as much skill as, how things work out in the standard play, even though it's very divergent from the standard play of the game, it's still teaching you a skill. And so that doesn't mean that, basically what I'm getting at is the map is not the territory here, right? You don't need to have the exact experience of playing a 1v1 multiplayer match on the ladder or whatever in order to train for that sort of situation, in order to be better prepared for that sort of situation. So really, as long as you're taught how to expand, how to, train lots of units, how to take map control, how to tech up, how to build compositions which work, and how to counter enemy offensives, how to defend versus, enemy attacks, how to handle enemy harassment. Like, these are all skills that some or all of them could be at play in any campaign mission that you really want to make. So, of course, you can teach core concepts that way. Like, these are core concepts to the RTS. You should probably have most of those, if not all of those, in play at pretty much any given mission. So it really just comes down to, like another one would be coordination with allies. Well, maybe it is actually a 1v1, or maybe you're playing solo. But, that being said, you still teaching you a lot of skills. So, yeah, I think generally speaking, you can do a lot with that. You can really use tutorials and campaign content to prepare you for multiplayer. And that core principle informs a lot of the design decisions that I make within my solo content, my co-op content. And because it's one of those situations where, I'm looking at the tutorial. Do I expect the average player who plays tutorials or who tries out new RTS games or whatever to be able to pass the tutorial without failing? Actually, I don't expect that. I mean, I make it very easy for them to hold out for a longer period of time than they would otherwise by placing some neutral anchors on high ground and giving them very defensible choke points that they can isolate and try their best to hold. But if you're a bad player, around 80 APM or something, most of the time, maybe you mostly just play the micro campaigns like Flame Knives or something. I don't know. If you're a player who doesn't have a lot of multiplayer experience and who doesn't have a lot of RTS experience, then you're definitely going to be mincemeat after a few rounds of this. And even beyond that, the tutorial will fail that will kill players who are even, better at StarCraft, maybe in the D ranked or something. And that I say better in the context of the example I just gave of the default campaign player who has 80 APM is probably F rank or something, you know what I mean? So you could be up there in the ranks and you could still lose to something like this, maybe even in the C rank range, just because you don't know CMBW. If you don't know the game, it's going to teach you by, putting you up against a lot of situations where unit interactions happen and remain consistent, but you get to play versus a lot of them. And it's kind of one note in the beginning, it's a lot of infantry spam, but he starts working in, fulcrum units and adding those in and getting you to the drip feed, so to speak, of showing you off more units over time. And that's definitely going to be a big deal. If you're not somebody who conventionally moves out and tries to attack the enemy in a fast period of time, yeah, you're probably going to get your ass handed to you on numerous occasions, right? I've tried to play very turtily, and even I have been overwhelmed a few times, mostly because I was just trying to get a screenshot or two for the game for one of these episodes, actually, and, playing at a faster than normal game speed to speed that process up. But, even I, as the author of the map, have to play an RTS, have to actually try to contend with the opponent, have to, do something proactive and, take map control and take expansions and hold avenues into my base and build defenses and tech up and all this other shit. You don't really get the opportunity to say that about many campaigns, many RTS campaign content at all. And that this is a tutorial that is going to fail players is actually pretty significant. So, I think in the last episode, I did talk a little bit about my tutorial plans. One of the things that I mentioned was that I want to demand improvement from weaker players. And again, that prepares them for multiplayer in some ways, right? Because multiplayer is going to be a lot of, especially if you're going up against more experienced players, it's going to be a lot of, oh, I failed. I got my ass handed to me. What could I have done better? How can I have improved? And one of the most recent Artosis casts, as of the time of recording, was a match between Soso and Zealot, a TVZ. And I think it was in the second match of that particular video. He mentioned that when you're behind in StarCraft, you want to think, how can I win? And when you're ahead in StarCraft, you want to think, how can I lose? And I think that's a good way to think about it, right? Like if you feel like you're ahead in this position and you actually find out that you are when you study the replay or whatever, then, your thoughts are, what could possibly happen for me to throw this advantage? And then you want to think about that and say, well, maybe my opponent is on the back foot because I have him contained. So one way that I could throw is by jumping into his defenses and losing my army and all my pressure. Or another way that I could throw is by waiting too long to pull the trigger. And so I need to focus on taking more map control and maybe getting one or two more bases up, maybe teching up, maybe reinforcing the front. Another thing he could maybe do is try to drop attack me. Okay, that's another way I could lose, is having my army have to pull back from the front so that I can defend my main from a drop attack or something. And then I lose a lot of economics and I lose a lot of pressure because of that. That could definitely be the case. So that would be one case where it's like, okay, if he's going to do that, if he's going to do any of these things, I need to be prepared for them. So at the very least, hedge my bets towards what's the most likely outcome that still sees me come out ahead from the trade, even if the game isn't over by the end of that. And then you just repeatedly ask, how do I get that advantage? Again, if you're losing, how can I come back? Well, again, if I'm being contained by a Protoss player and I'm a Terran player, well, I just mentioned, I can turtle up. I can try to push out and see what I can do to tempt fate and can I whittle him down or push him out and try to take a base and all this other stuff. Can I do a drop attack? Can I just turtle up long enough to tech up and get a tech advantage that way and then be unbreakable? There's so many different things that you can do in this context that it feels like, when you're thinking of it in those terms and when you indicate to the player that somehow that's a good philosophy. And I might even try to work that into some of the dialogue is, maybe one of the things that your character or your character's aide might end up saying in the tutorial is, how can we get ahead? How can we take the advantage here? And then versus, if they're already on, if they are the ones who are doing good damage and the worker counts in their favor and the base counts in their favor and stuff, maybe I can detect that and have some sort of dialogue that mentions all right, man, you seem to be in the driver's seat here. What's the thing that could make you lose? Think about that. And prepare for it. Think about what could fulfill that checkbox there. What could check that off and prepare for it. And that's how you're gonna hold this advantage and see it through to the end. Something like that. So anyway, in that context, there's a lot here that I think is pretty significant for the general approach of designing content, but tutorials in particular, they can be a little rough. Something that we definitely want, and maybe we won't have initially for the tutorial, is we want to avoid players feeling significantly distraught, I guess, over hearing the same dialogue options over and over again. And they can hit the escape key to skip that, but it would still be nice if they didn't, if they weren't in a situation where, they had to do that to begin with, right? I've talked a lot about having bank data for this exact purpose. If we can detect, have you heard this dialogue event before? If no, play the dialogue event. And if yes, play a truncated version of the dialogue event. Or maybe in some specific cases, don't play anything at all. That would be one case where I think would work out pretty well, because you can have this intro that is maybe 30 seconds long, and that doesn't sound like a long time, but after the fifth time listening to it, that's now 2.5 minutes. You definitely don't want that to be adding up, right? So that's in a situation where we can play it and it can be 5 seconds long instead, and that's a lot snappier, and suddenly you're just in the game and it's not as much of a problem. And even still, if this truncated version of the dialogue event hurts you and annoys you, you can still hit escape. So realistically speaking, that covers a lot of ground. Some events are useful as reads. So, you might have the longer version of that event in a player has arrived in another campaign mission, not the tutorial, because we won't have that in the tutorial, but, a player has arrived, another opponent or maybe an ally or something. And, there's a dialogue event announcing their arrival or indicating that they have arrived. Or maybe saying hey, 2 minutes till the reinforcements come or something, right? When that happens, that's a read. That's an indication for the player that they should be, preparing for some sort of outcome, or maybe on the hunt or on the lookout or something. Maybe trying to help their ally that just arrived or something like that, right? And in that context, you want some sort of dialogue event to truncate that or to punctuate that. But if you have a situation where it's 30 seconds every time, that can be really annoying. So having the one-time event that's good and long and as long as it needs to be, of course, still, cut down for, the fact that you're playing a game and you shouldn't be distracted from that by having characters try to, I don't know, wax lyrical or philosophical. But when you're in a situation about that sort of thing, okay, the subsequent times just have a, I'm here now, or, something like that, where it's very, very to the point and still maybe it even has some cute little way that you could imagine the characters have done this before and this is their second time at it or something. Like you could imagine a situation where that, if you were going to do that really out and out, blatantly, one of the things you'd probably just say is this again, something like that, right? Like that would be more for a comedy project probably, but something like that could work. You could imagine a situation like that. So in that context, I think there's loads of opportunity for us to explore things in a way that other people really just haven't explored. And, one of the key concepts here that we want to talk about is that content has to be challenging in order to teach these concepts. You're not going to learn, that philosophy that I mentioned from an Artosis video. You're not going to learn that from beating a computer that's got 10,000 starting resources and fucking does nothing but attack you with like 9 Zethra cores or something. Like that's just useless. So what can you realistically learn in this context, right? How can you approach doing something like, completing content in this way? Well, challenging content is going to teach its own lessons. And I think that's a significant point that a lot of people miss is how can I approach designing content, right? This is my question as like for myself, basically as a designer, like I need to approach designing content as both, obviously having its own reason for existing outside of the meta context of, teaching players how to play the game. It also needs to like be good content, right? And that's interesting because it's like not just good education, but it's also good in and of itself. Like even if you already know these details, it might still be worth playing because it is still challenging and it still teaches you how to, or not teaches you, but it still presents you with an interesting conundrum, an interesting set of difficult things to overcome and enemies to conquer and all this other stuff, right? And, obviously the story should also be ideally good in that context too. Although I imagine, particularly with the crowd here, like it's kind of mixed, some of the people who are donating on Coffee, which I do always appreciate, of course, are a little bit more on the front of like, hey, we really like the world building aspect and we really want to get invested in characters. In fact, that's one of the questions that I'm going to answer right at the beginning here when I get to that section of the podcast. But when we're in a situation for most of the people, I think of, people like Mesk and Fagudo, people like, even like Veek, for example, like some of these people are actually contributing to the project in one way or another. I'm not saying that they don't think that I've got interesting ideas for characters, but what I am saying is that's not the primary reason that they're here whatsoever. Like they're here for the content. They're here for the experience of playing against an enemy that's, okay, sure, maybe some of them will find abuse cases. Maybe some of them will more aggressively like try to cheese the AI than others or something. But if they play a standard game or if they play something closer to a standard game, and, of course, if we can account for as many cheeses and silly ways to win as possible, this is all, these are all possibilities is what I'm getting at for the opportunity for us to successfully create content that just nobody's ever actually experienced before, the kind of content that nobody's ever seen before. The tutorial where the enemy trains more than 5 units or something, when the tutorial AI beats your ass with like 100 Mavericks, like that's going to be memorable for people. That's going to make people think, holy shit, I just got stormed the gates by like a massive army in the tutorial and I lost in the tutorial. Like that's actually going to be something that people say. So that's going to teach you a couple things. Like one, I expect you to lose. Like as the designer, I expect you to fail. Even if it's small failures, like you thought you could win in 10 minutes, but instead it was a grind and you only won in 40. Like in some ways, that's a failure to close, right? The AI was pernicious and held on for a longer period of time. Now, obviously, there's the elephant in the room about like, yeah, of course, the AI does have these inalienable advantages where they're going to be in situations where they have the slight resource multiplier and they know where you are relative to the, your opponents. And I can equalize some of these. Like I can make it so that, you have vision on their starting location, right? That's revealed in the fog. So at the very least, like roughly where to look and investigate them. But I'm not going to give you a resource multiplier to be on even keel. The reason for them having that to begin with is because they're just not very efficient with their army. So I don't know that we'll ever be able to fix that within CMBW. But besides something like that, which obviously can be quite negative for the end user experience if they are expecting to learn how soon somebody can afford to expand or how soon, how long somebody can hold out on 1 or 2 bases or something, they're going to have skewed intuition, I guess. They're going to have a weird frame of reference for that if they're basing it off of the AI alone. And that is an imperfect way to teach the player. But what is not imperfect is the idea that, hey, broadly speaking, their efficiency per resource spend is probably going to be about the same as a player, of equivalent skill to that, whatever the AI's equivalent skill is. Just because, like, in the same way, like a player like myself, this isn't a humble brag, I'm not that good, but I'm also not as bad as the AI. player like myself is going to have more efficiency, usually, on average. And then, players like maybe Mystery Meat, who's usually consistently, he probably takes like, I would say I probably have like a 4-1 record against him or something, maybe 3-1. I don't know. Like, he wins most of the games is what I'm getting at. In that situation, like, we're kind of comparable. He's clearly on another level in terms of like core mechanical skill or whatever, and maybe just like macro reps and stuff. And, the point where he is weakest is particularly due to his playstyle is probably the early game, and maybe some of the games that I've won have been early game aggression, which some people will say is not as skillful as like an actual macro game. And I can see where they're coming from for that too. So anyway, the point I'm getting at there is like, he's going to have even more efficiency per mineral spent usually, although he often floats money anyway. So, it happens to the best of us, boys. But I'll just look at that and I'll say, hey, we're in a situation where the content is going to teach you to expect a certain amount of performance out of your opponents and under certain contexts. And I think that part will always be the same, or at least barring some very specific niche cases, it will generally be the same. And that's still good enough for me as like essentially a tech demo, a prototype, if you will, of what the RTS genre could become if we adopted this approach. And, if people like Veek and myself actually had proper tools for handling AI instead of the junk that Lard left us with. And of course, if maybe, that's definitely something that I'm really excited about. Like Kairos, which is the scripting language that is handled for Antikythera stuff. When Veek returns to work on that and gets it a little bit further, feature complete, I think it's pretty close to it right now anyway. But when he starts to build out the AI segments of that, like where we actually have AI logic running, they can attack and they can do certain other things. Like that's going to be so epic to the point where we'll actually have eventually, this isn't going to come quickly or easily, but eventually we're going to have stuff like the AI being able to contain you, the AI being able to drop down, sets of anchors or whatever, like the corollary. I'm just going to use like CMW shit for now, but the corollaries being like they can put down anchors and phalanxes and try to like wall you in, or they can like move a whole host of Dracodons up towards, surrounding your area, have that spatial awareness to like pull back when you start to attack them from the high ground and, just like keep you from expanding and scout the expansions to make sure that you don't have anything and all this other stuff. That's going to be shit that they can do. They'll establish patrol routes with Skithrakors around the certain areas just to catch transports that are trying to drop, or air units that are trying to go on a harassment vector or stuff like that. Like that's going to be useful information. Like they'll actually be able to respond in some ways. So I think that's going to be something I'm really looking forward to, because that does give you a lot more of an understanding of like how a player might play without the AI being gimped and like forced into this fashionable situation where they're like, oh, it's, our AI is so cutting edge. The fact I can't even use AI in the normal way that I would use it, because obviously it's been like co-opted to mean general AI, or like whatever these AI tools are, I guess it's definitely not general AI, but it's like, GPT and stuff. Like, I don't care about that. That's definitely not what I'm interested in. What I'm looking for is computer, like controlled opposition, right? Like, we used to just call that computer AI or AI in general, like game AI, right? That's what I'm looking at. And that kind of thing, for it to be able to adapt to some degree and be a little bit more on the flexible side and sort of recognize what it needs to do. That's going to be really neat to see. And, I'm not claiming it'll be foolproof. It'll be a hell of a lot better and more versatile than what we've seen out of something like StarCraft 1, even Cosmonic Brood War, as much better as it is than StarCraft 1 by comparison. So I guess that pretty much brings us to the end. Again, like challenging content, teaching us its own lessons, right? Teaching its own lessons to the players, to the, the designer, even as I'm trying to make this stuff. That's going to be a big deal, right? So the end of this topic really is just what I really want to see is an opportunity to welcome new players, to give them the onboarding that they definitely need, and to introduce them to the idea that, hey, they should even expect to fail in the tutorial, because failure is a part of how you improve, and I'm looking for you to improve. And I see video games as a potential vector for self-improvement. And I know that sounds real wacky to say out loud on the internet, but that's genuinely what I think about what video games could become. And they just aren't that yet, by and large. So let's see if we can make them that. We have arrived at the location of the coffee questions. So if you are interested in supporting the content, you know where to go. It's a link in the description to ko-fi.com/Protagonist 7. Alexhandr is our first person up. I almost said contestant, but realistically, he's our first homie who is asking a question here. And I already hinted at it earlier. He asks, how do you envision campaign characters to interact with one another? And I got to admit, his question was actually like a paragraph, and most of it was not a question. It was just sort of like musing. So I'll refer to certain parts of that. But definitely something that is grounded within CMBW, because he goes on to ask about like Zerg and Protoss and Terran and stuff. So he's not asking about like, general stuff. He's talking about specifically how I envision the new setting essentially within CMBW to work and how the dynamics will be, particularly with characters. So, in To Touch the Sun, which is a campaign that is actually intended to be introductory, but not necessarily a tutorial, right? It's more like, hey, you can check this out and see what you can do. There's a point within the second mission where you uncover essentially like technology that was being used by the Nidus Trinity, which is a faction of Terrans that specifically look like they really like the idea of Zerg taking over the whole sector and stuff, to put it bluntly. So there was technology that was being used by them, but it was actually Imperial technology to begin with. You play as the Orion Imperium in this. And in that context, you're actually in a spot where you're able to attempt, more or less, to interact with Zerg specifically, or at the very least communicate. And this technology provides that. I haven't decided how I'm going to present the Zerg specifically. I don't know if they'll be speaking, like, basically if the communications will simply be like readouts that are read in that sense, like they're like some sort of sequence that is read or translated by an adjutant type character, which is not really a character but like a sequence or whatever, like a device, if you will, or like another character that's like manning the terminal essentially and like checking it out. That's definitely like going to be interesting to see what I decide to do with that. And of course, like, since there was a question that was asked, I think maybe it was before Alexander's time actually, but it was on a few episodes ago. I was talking about well, maybe it was Alexander's question to begin with, actually. Anyway, I was talking about what I planned for the Zerg. This might have been Three Crow's question, where he was asking me about how I plan to present the Zerg. And I talked about an idea that Balethal had about it being like a chorus of voices, and I kind of like took that a step further and stuff. So anyhow, when we're in that context, like, yeah, there's a lot that is yet to be nailed down, and I'm going to be reviewing that kind of content that I've made before talking about it and my other thoughts and notes, and I'm going to be channeling that into what I do with the Zerg tutorial. So we'll get an answer about Zerg presentation in particular, because his first part of this paragraph was, for Zerg, there's no real characters as there is with Protoss and Terran. I'm interested to see how that transpires too. I think it's one of those things where the Zerg are definitely going to be in an interesting position where you're going to be expecting them to deal some kind of general amount of, like, how are they going to actually communicate? What are they going to do? How are we going to handle them? Because it's a hive mind. And it's not really like in the context of the Overmind and other type of Zerg characters where they have personality in the same sense. So there has to be like some representation of it, right? And if it's going to be a chorus, then that chorus should have some sort of representation associated with it too. So I'm not 100% sure what we're going to do with that. Like, the chorus should basically be characterized. Like, there's probably going to be different choruses that you hear. And so one chorus would be like, one tendril, for example. But, I was also thinking about it in the context of, there might be competing organs, right? So maybe the organs are the choruses, and they, together they make up the tendril. Something like that could be the case. As far as the other cases, there's more to this question. There's an inevitable alliance with the Terrans against the Zerg. He's talking about with Protoss here. The thing about the Terran factions wanting to fight the Zerg off and wanting to side with the Protoss, like, yes to the first point, probably not to the second point. The Golden Republic is sort of xenophilic towards Protoss in the same way that the Nidus Trinity is clearly apocalyptically xenophilic towards Zerg. When you're in the context of the Golden Republic, yeah, sure, they'll be interested in forging alliances with Protoss, but they're also a little bit more nuanced, because obviously Protoss politics are a little bit more nuanced, and easier to understand for Terrans anyway. Like, for example, the Golden Republic is aware of things like the Starbound, and how a lot of them are actually, not just vagrants, not just, characters that no longer have been, like, they've been exiled or whatever, but they're also made up of criminals. that maybe are even trying to escape prosecution by way of becoming exiles, like going into self-exile. And that means that, if there's a local branch of the primacy, the divine primacy, then the Golden Republic is going to be out there thinking, maybe we could actually use these guys to make good on, like sort of like curry favor with the divine primacy in this sector or in this area, because now we're going to be able to turn some prisoners in, basically, or turn some fugitives in, right? So that can be like one such example where, maybe the Golden Republic would want to side with whatever Protoss area, sector, whatever Protoss sect is within this area, right? So it could be a faction of Protoss like the Order of the Sacred Templar that mostly uses robotics to spare the lives of Protoss warriors. And in that context, like they're going to have like a custom replacement for the Legionnaire that's going to be automated, for example. And, that's a case where, okay, well, we have something different, like factionally. And then you look at the context for the Calendric Knights, they're not going to be too interested in siding with the Golden Republic themselves, because they view Protoss as, it's sort of like the Order of the Sacred Templar views Protoss as like sacred. Obviously, in the context of the Calendric Knights, they're more like, hey, we view us as superior. Like there's a bit of a difference there, right? Where they actually look down on the other life forms. So that's a case where I think it's a bit more nuanced. It's not just like, hey, all Protoss will always ally against, with all Terran against all Zerg. That's definitely not going to be the case. Some sub-factions of the various races are going to side with the Zerg, right? So you're thinking of like, Zerg will probably be allied with Starbound that have tried to like interface or usurp control of the local organ or something, if they're really that desperate, or if they just happen to not care about doing something like that. Then you have stuff like obviously the Nidus Trinity. Even in some cases, there's been cases where the Orion Imperium, as mentioned in the description of To Touch the Sun, they have devised technology which can interface with the Zerg. I don't think it's going to be like controlling the Zerg per se. They might believe that it is, but I don't know that it will be. That can be interesting ground to explore in the future. And then, there's another point that he says, will the Zerg's arrival be pure coinkydink or planned? That is going to be explained within the content of the campaigns, right? Because the purpose of the Zerg is not explained. And I actually want it to be a little bit interesting. Like, I talked about this in a previous episode, but the interesting part is trying to find out or trying to devise an answer. It could be that they just do what they're doing because that's the way that they are, and hey, they're here, so of course they would do that. Or it could be that they have some higher purpose that is not yet explained or not yet being discussed or been decided or whatever. It could certainly be that they have a goal in mind that isn't just control everything or consume everything, but is something else, right? And in fact, that could also even be potentially the source of the discord that occasionally occurs between Zerg tendrils, because they do often end up waging wars against each other, or there's some collateral in their consuming quests. And again, the final point of this part of this paragraph was, I can hopefully expect a lot less anime and more common sense. Yeah, well, you can, because the campaign content is going to, like, the plots of the campaign content is going to be about it's going to be about war and military operations and, fates of star systems and stuff, and not about love stories or character drama. To the extent that there's going to be character drama, that's going to be, in many ways, it's probably going to be like an analogy or like a reflection of the bigger drama of, like, you might imagine a character, may end up having friction with somebody else because he previously betrayed them and then came back to, help them or something, like that's part of their history. And maybe that is reflected in the fact that he, whatever they're dealing with right now on the global war scale that actually makes sense within the RTS is a result of maybe another character or maybe that same character selling them out or like fucking up and luring like Zerg there or something like that. There's many options that could be there. You could imagine some situation like that. Like the character drama is going to be decidedly more respectful of the player's time and interactions, because it's not going to like subsume the overall point of the story, if you will. The point is very much the large scale stuff. So the character drama stuff is going to be there as, I won't say it's like there superfluously, but I will say it is there more subtly. and less about, you know, you could imagine that most people are fairly professional in this universe. There's going to be some exceptions to that rule, but, you know, that's a separate thing. And finally, he asks, how long do you expect the 3 primary race campaigns to be? Well, homie, I don't know that there's going to be 3 primary race campaigns. To Touch the Sun is Terran. Day of Blood is short and Terran. That's going to be like 6 missions. To Touch the Sun is not actually, I guess it's not fair to say it's Terran. It's like, it's Terran, and then it's Zerg, and then it's Protoss, and then it's an association of, like, basically user select is my plan for that, but it might just end up not being that. I'm not sure. But that's why it's an introductory campaign, sort of like gives you experience playing all of them. And then obviously there's another campaign, Reign of Sand, that I've been working on a little bit behind the scenes. That is Terran focused. I'm not sure if it'll remain one race the entire way through. That's probably going to be like 8 missions or something. Maybe even less. Maybe it'll be 6 as well. Actually, did I get that right? Is Day of Blood actually planned to be 6 missions or what? Let me check this out. Yeah, it is. Okay. Because I wasn't sure, because I think Reign of Sand, I wasn't decided on how many missions there were going to be. So anyway, that's definitely something to keep in mind. Whether there will definitely be tutorials for each race, and those will probably be, in total, when they're completed, those will probably be like close to 3 or 4 missions a pop. Maybe 1 or 2. Like, I don't know about the Protoss one, because again, we have to refactor their general approach to things. So how they build structures and whatnot. But we'll see. And with that said, I guess that closes out the question. So thanks for your support, homie, and we'll be moving on to the next one. Now, the rest of the questions here for the coffee section are all about Xibalba, the name for the world that I have created for games like Cosmonarchy Retail, which we'll probably end up renaming at some point, since Cosmonarchy Brood War is definitely going to show up in more searches now that it's becoming a little bit more on the popular side, and that'll just muddy the waters a lot, so we'll see what we end up doing with that. That being said, the Shambler asks, what is the most evil alliance you can think of in Xibalba? What makes it compelling, and what would be the dynamic? Or what would the dynamic be? Well, for this, of course, I am going to go ahead and pull up the Xibalba faction list, the regency list, I should say. Evil insofar as, I guess, malevolent and that sort of thing. Because, you know, there's like an element of, for example, the Kolopoazos, which are, you know, very mischievous, but also in a way that's like, you know, they're very conniving. They're very deleterious to, for example, the mental health, the psychological health of the other nations, the other regencies. They're sort of like these sort of perhaps extra-dimensional entities that see the world of Xibalba as simply a vector for entertainment, and they have a very twisted sense of humor. Very twisted sense of entertainment, in fact. So you could see that as evil, but it's not necessarily for personal gain. So in that sense, I kind of like pointing out the Kolopoazos in the context of, like, you know, they're very much outside the realm of everything. So it's not like they would want to, you know, take over the whole place or, you know, establish total dominion. They actually like the fact that there are warring factions, because that gives them an opportunity for mischief and for, you know, being creative with how they approach destabilizing the area. And, you know, I've said this before, but the way that they react if they fail to get what they want, if they, you know, aren't successful in their subterfuge, it's almost like the way that you would react if you lost a game in you know, and it wasn't even a competitive match necessarily. It was like a casual game, like, oh, I died in Dark Souls or something, you know, I don't know, something like that. That's almost how they react, right? They're just like, oh, what the hell, man? I can't believe I didn't get what I wanted, you know, sort of like that, but filtered through an alien lexicon instead of the more mundane that we have. And that's sort of like one of the ways that I would describe it anyway. And the reason why that's significant is because I'm not sure you can really quantify them as evil in the same way that you could easily classify something like the Solar Throne as being evil, right? They exist as obviously these sort of like misbegotten, miscreant entities that were created by the Githrovans only for the Solar Throne themselves to essentially like pervert and subsume all of the things which the Githrovans held dear. And I look at that and I think, well, you know, it's not that their creation was evil. It's more that they, you know, what they turned into, and they deliberately pervert these symbols of, you know, what is near and dear, what is religiously pertinent and stuff to the Githrovans. That makes the Solar Throne very, I would say, malevolent, right? Decidedly so in terms of their motivations. So they're an early contender I just, considering that you can't really say that the Kolopazos are doing it for the same reasons, I'm not sure that you could qualify them in the same way, but the Solar Throne are definitely an early contender. You could also be looking at, I don't know if you would call this evil, but the Rune are very like greed focused, and they are also very warlike. So they manifest it in a very like offensive sort of approach where you could say that they are an affront to any sort of attempt at diplomacy or political anything. Like their alliances are purely of convenience, and they're all temporary, even amongst themselves, right? So that makes the Rune interesting as a sort of, you could imagine them as being chaotic evil in terms of like the classic D&D alignments. Whereas the Solar Throne, I guess they would be neutral evil, because I wouldn't say lawful. It doesn't really make that much sense for them. So that's something to think about anyway for the Rune. They're much more about the chaotic stuff. And, what else would you even say for evil, right? That's the tough part. You look at the Pr0totype, they're very much in a similar boat to the Rune, but for very different reasons. They are the chaotic evil. They're the ones that just, they can't die, so they just seek out any form of relief. They seek out any form of, momentary reprieve from their suffering. And as a result of that, they are prone to flights of fancy. They are prone to just, disregarding all other species and what they want, because like they exist on a time scale that is unimaginable, and thus they can't really be reasoned with in the same way, right? You would have to offer something to them if you wanted them to be a part of your alliance, and they would welcome any sort of attempt at actually destroying them for obvious reasons. So it's not like they're above attacking stuff, and they'll take some pleasure in absolutely ruining the standing armies of other nations and such. So that would be one way to have them have some sort of sadistic aspect to it. You could consider them a sort of chaotic evil as well, because of how strange they are in terms of their motivations, right? It's very hard for us to wrap our heads around that. And I suppose the Makral Das could be seen as a bit of an evil regency, an evil force. The Makralon specifically could be, considered these sort of like masters, but these are more, I don't want to say lawful evil, but if they're also, in a maybe a neutral evil sense, you could see them as like, well, we believe that we're the superior entities. And, there's the psychopathy angle, right? Where they simply don't even think about things in the same terms as what we would. So yeah, if you wanted to consider that, we're starting to get some candidates to answer this question. So I would probably say the most evil would be, Pr0totype and Solar Throne together out of the ones that I've said so far. You're thinking about the fact that the Solar Throne specifically exists to pervert and antagonize, at least one other regency using the symbols of, of peace and of other positive things, and perverting them, right? So if they exist for that reason, and that's one of the main things that they do, that would make the Solar Throne decidedly very malevolent and quite malicious in with what it does. Imagine posing as a Githrovan savior fleet, only for it to actually be, a slaver ship or a planetary bombardment craft or something, some sort of fleet like that. And then baiting people out just to give them hope before you, enslave them forever, or you destroy them. Something like that could be, something that you might see out of the Solar Throne. And then if you look at the Pr0totype, obviously they would be along for the ride in the sense that they'd be interested in and maybe amused by what the Solar Throne get up to. And their technology would allow the Solar Throne to, have a lot more of a deathless sort of power, considering they're not feeling entities in the same way because they're constructs. The Solar Throne probably wouldn't have as much of a problem with the Pr0totype curse as the Pr0totype themselves do. So that would be another thing to think about, is that like the sort of ramifications of some of the unique racial traits of each one of these regencies, and how that would play into the lore. So I would say that. And again, if you wanted a more, perhaps a more chaotic pairing, you could imagine that the Makral Das try to like maybe convert and enslave a group of Rune, and the Rune maybe play along or actually are under the thrall, but still released to do the bidding of their masters. And in a way, by doing so, or in doing so, they would basically be giving into their base instincts and what they normally do anyway, which is just absolutely rape and pillage anything that comes into contact with them. And I'm using the term rape here a little bit more in the context of like, what would you say? The metaphorical context, as opposed to actual, sexual penetration. Don't think they're really that interested in that because that's not really related to it. But they're very much excess. They're a regency of excess, a race of excess. So there you go. Some answers to those questions, or to that specific question. As far as the dynamic goes, right? That was another part of this. I don't know if any of them are particularly compelling to me that like stand out or whatever. I look at I'm looking at the context of like the question was basically asked with the idea that what would I find compelling about some of these pairings. I think it would be just another interesting way to explore the unique aspects of each regency, but like how do they interplay, right? That's like putting them in an interesting scenario. I've said before that when you're writing a story, what you really want to do, at least this is my process, is I build up a set of characters and I establish relationships as they are at the default, and then I also establish like what these characters are, who they are, how they would carry themselves in the world, and what decisions they would make. And then when you have that context, you can give yourself a little bit of a leg up on any other writing that you do, because you can put yourself into any situation and the story kind of tells you what's going to happen. Or at least the characters, their motivations are known to you. What kind of decisions they would make is known to you. All of that information is in your own head as the writer, and therefore you can come up with a very coherent way for the story to progress afterwards. You decide the outcome of some of this stuff, but if you're in a situation where you're trying to rule out like, okay, well, would this race win, or would that race win, or this character win, would that character win, that's the kind of thing that you have to figure out how to tell in an interesting way for the player to experience. But as a writer, that's usually what I end up doing. So I just say it's always compelling to me to explore that. But the dynamic between, the Solar Throne and the Pr0totype, I think I've already answered that, where, the Solar Throne are happy to use whatever. They're happy to conquer, but they're also happy to, if there's an actual symmetric relationship in terms of the technology that would be shared or the advantages that would be gained from either side, they would be acceptable. It would be acceptable to them for the, something like the Pr0totype to be sharing their technology in that sense. Meanwhile, the Pr0totype themselves are in a situation where they would be amused by how the Solar Throne do their things and pervert their symbols and stuff. So that would be amusing to them. And there would definitely be some sort of, some sort of relishing in the sadism about that from the Pr0totype perspective. As far as the Rune and the Macroldas, the Macrolon believe themselves to be the rightful, shepherds, or not really shepherds, but like rulers and emperors of the setting. And therefore they are happy to control anything and control any dynamic, and they'll often reframe dynamics to be even more in line with that, where even if it's actually supposed to be this sort of equal sort of relationship, it's like a good version of what Alarak was doing in StarCraft II: Legacy of the Void, where he kept saying like, yes, go ahead. Like he was really over the top with it and stupid about it. But he would say like, when there was like that stupid tug of war mission, and when you walk next to him, sometimes he'd say shit like, yes, my slaves, let's continue. Like a good a nuanced version of that would be happening with the Macroldas with any sort of dynamic, where they'd be like, and of course you you will continue to assist us or serve us in in this, they'd find some way to phrase that in a more nuanced and interesting way, where it's constantly reframed as whoever else is with them is like on the back foot, which is kind of funny because it might not always be the case. So that would be interesting, trying to appeal to the base instincts of the Rune. That wouldn't be unfamiliar territory, and since they are of course psychokinetic and stuff, they have this ability to jump into other people's minds to some degree, at the very least to do certain things like mind control. That would be something to think about. So anyway, hopefully that answers the question. The Rune themselves, of course, just a bit wacky, a bit some could even call them goofy, I guess, like the degree to which they are so hell-bent and needlepoint focused, as Mesk has recently taken to saying, on one specific thing, which is, the accumulation of excess. That is really their nature, you could say. And when you're considering it from that perspective, the fact that that's kind of all they are is a little bit surprising to people when they hear about that. Like, there's not really going to be like scholars of Rune, that like go a different way or whatever. They are kind of like pack animals in a sense. So there's going to be some limited amount of, you could say, evolutionary diversity between some of what they have. But for the most part, like, it's not within their nature to be, what would you say, domesticated or fit for any other purpose. So to that degree, they're very one note, but in a way that obviously playing off the other regencies makes them interesting to explore anyway, at least for me. Now, Myrian asks, what would the Xibalba regencies think of the Onitar factions and vice versa? And I was thinking about this question because it's a little bit hard to say. Like, I was recently considering how to explain the power gap between stuff in, StarCraft or like Cosmonic Brood War and stuff in Xibalba, or stuff in, Cosmonic Brood War and stuff in Onitar. And realistically speaking, like, the age of humans is over by the time Xibalba has any content with it, like in the RTS game or in like the FPS or whatever. Like, the age of humans is long since passed. So basically, chronologically in the universe's lifetime, Onitar takes place, well after our current time in modern day, probably a little bit, or like maybe around the same time frame actually as something like a StarCraft. Maybe a little bit later than that, cut by a couple thousand years or something. But, it's not a million miles removed from that. Meanwhile, on the context of something like Xibalba, you're talking about many millennia later. Like, it's a long, long time. And because the universe is more mature, but not so mature that like it's impossible for you to travel or see other stars, right? Like, because there's at least the projection currently is that eventually it'll get to the point where you can't you don't receive the light because of the gaps between galaxies become too vast. Although, even still, that leaves you with a pretty big amount of space within a single galaxy to play with. But that's not quite the scale that I'm going for. Anyhow, the point there is that when you're in a situation like that, you expect things to be more advanced to some degree. There's going to be some agents that have been able to preserve themselves for that long. There might even be like human colonies or something like a human, whatever a human turns into, that many years removed. Or maybe there's like some time capsules or some wrecked tech that's like, related in that sense. But it's not something that I'm interested in exploring. So, it's just for speculation, really. And the reason why that's significant is because that does mean that there's going to be a bit of a power gap, right? So we look at, for example, the Terrans in Cosmonic Brood War. They would not hold up versus any of the Onitar factions. The power levels there are much higher. And then if you compare that even, like, the closest thing that Onitar has to a faction which could contend with some of the factions or regencies within Xibalba would probably be Entropic. But Entropic are not really in the same sense, like, they would need a long time to build up, and their tech would still be dwarfed by stuff that had been created much later on, much more recently, in a much more futuristic environment where a lot more smithing has been done, right, and a lot more elements are available. So when we think about it in those circumstances, I would say that, like, one of the things I was thinking about recently is if I had the opportunity to build out a fourth race, I would probably do the Escozi, which is one of the member nations within the Ember Seat, which in and of itself is a sort of coalition regency within Xibalba. And even then, I'm not really sure, because I think the Escozi by themselves would be able to contend quite easily, or at the very least comparatively, to the Onitar factions, which, as I just said, are a step above the CMBW factions in terms of the power gap. Not that they exist in the same universe, but even if they did, it's like so far removed that it doesn't really matter. So the reason why I was thinking of like having the Ascosi there, even though again in a time frame sense it definitely wouldn't make sense for them because like Xibalba is supposed to be set way later. It's just for the purposes of like if I had a fourth race and I was going to try to build out some sort of understanding of like what the Ascosi's identity was meant to be, it would be kind of cool. And in a neat way, it would almost be like advertising, or not really advertising, but like making a promise about like the interesting things you might see out of fully custom races when we get around to building our own shit a little bit more aggressively, right? Because now Vika's working his job, and obviously I've then, as a result, turned towards CMBW as a more frequent vector for my work. When you're in that context, it's like, oh, okay, well now there's some sort of room to be played around with here. Now we can talk about like, here's what I can do. With the Ascosi and stuff, like here's what you can expect from me as a tech tree designer with a completely custom set of concepts, as opposed to building out based on a pre-existing roster and then padding it out quite significantly and reevaluating a lot of other stuff. In this case, it would be a much more top-down approach, which technically I haven't done yet in the context of people playing it in multiplayer and stuff. I've done it plenty of times for planning the Xibalba and Onitar and Pangea races, like the playable factions and stuff. But I haven't done it from the ground up in CMBW before. So I thought that would have been an interesting opportunity to explore, and also kind of an acute way saying, yeah, the Ascosi are able to dominate, or at least compare to the strength levels of CMBW factions, and they are one part of a massive coalition of other races, because that's the only way they could compete with the other Xibalba regencies. So like, just to illustrate that power gap, I thought would be kind of interesting to do. That being said, hopefully that explains what the regencies would think of each other. Like the Xibalba regencies would maybe be, some of them would be interested in terms of studying them. You imagine the Githrovans would be interested in safeguarding them. And they would need to be safeguarded because otherwise they'd be absolutely ramshackle, taken advantage of, run roughshod over. There would be very much no quarter, and there would be no opportunity really for many of the Onitar factions to do much. If they banded together, maybe they could do something, but I still feel like the tech depth would be really significant, so the power gap would maintain. And there would be certain ones that obviously they would be very ill-equipped to deal with. Things like the Cathethrons or whatever, where it's just like, how do you even fight that? The Thruk would also fall into that category to some degree. These more cosmic things. I guess the Avot would be another one. And yeah, I think when you're looking at it from that perspective, the Xibalba regencies would be seen as almost godlike in terms of power, and the Onitar factions, by comparison, would be seen as very much not so good, not so powerful, I guess you could say, because that's just the nature of the gap between the technologies. 3Crow asks, which Xibalba regency do you think has the greatest potential to defeat all others? So this is him asking which one could be the supreme menace. Hands down, Kolopo-Azos could do it pretty much at any time. But again, they choose not to because that would ruin one of their playgrounds, right? One of their sandboxes to, have some fun in, you could say. They're just like, they are essentially godlike entities. Now, some people will hear that and probably feel like maybe that diminishes some of the stakes. But the things that the Kolopo-Azos are doing, there is a reason that, or a couple of reasons, I guess, that hint at a bit of a higher reason or higher need to do this. That maybe there's more to it than them simply choosing to spare the cosmos and not destroy it all. That maybe if they don't do what they're doing, something else could be happening. So that would be another thing that I would say is that, like, trust me, I know what I'm doing, and I feel anyway that I know what I'm doing in this context, and it's going to be interesting anyway, the reason why they choose to keep their powers in some form of check. That being said, if you set aside the Kolopo-Azos, which do exist very much outside of things, like, the Cathethrons have the means, but not really the will. Like, their motivation is also a little bit of an interesting one, in terms of it being a bit of a black box. I guess the Rosellium on a long enough timescale will do it, unless they're stopped by one of these more cosmic entities, because they just have the capacity to consume anything that they come into contact with, right? They are the runaway paperclip machine. They are the machine consciousness that essentially works to create, convert resources into, or matter into resources in that sense. So eventually that's what they're going to do to the whole cosmos if left unchecked. It's just, that's a very long amount of time that it would take. So I guess like inevitably they would, unless they were actually like stamped out of existence by a more cosmic entity that has access to dimensional powers that we do not personally understand. Obviously, the Psychora have some localized ability to do this sort of thing, but they probably can't overwhelm all of the denizens within this setting. And as a result, I don't think they can. They wouldn't qualify. Obviously, I'm glossing over a lot of the default factions, the more like standard factions in terms of their power levels, like the Ancifi, which are somewhat comparable to humans in some ways. Obviously, there's some elements of them that are novel and dynamic because they are not humans. But that would be one example. The Emberseat, of course, the Keltar and Githrovans, the Makrodas even, that sort of stuff. Basically, besides the Resellium, all of the default regencies that you're going to get, or I guess the Resellium aren't actually in there just yet, but so if you look at the order of release, we've got the Ancifi, Emberseat, Keltar, Githrovan, Makrodas, and Psychora. Like all of those retail ones, the first 6 that I plan on including in the base game, those ones are in a spot where they cannot realistically do much. The Orlathrae are another sort of similar to the Resellium, but a bit more on the organic side. You can say that they're our musing and meditation on Zerg as a concept, the force of nature that cannot really be reasoned with and has its own higher entity and higher motivation, higher purpose that doesn't seem to be possible to communicate with in the same sense. That's a case where they could theoretically do the same thing that the Resellium are, but that's on a time limit, right? That's hard capped in terms of how much ground they can cover over a certain amount of time. Meanwhile, the Solar Throne and the Oros would be up next in terms of the order of release. That's a case where the Solar Throne has the technological power, but again, not really the will. If there's nothing around for them to subsume and pervert, then I guess they could take total dominion over things and then, just have everybody else enslaved in some way, shape, or form, or cataloged and stuffed in a museum somewhere, like Gadamemter, for example. But that would be a situation where I'm not sure that they would do that. It doesn't seem to be within their programming, you could say, their nature, if you want to use that term instead, that they would do something like that. Meanwhile, the you look at, for example, the Oros. They're more in the sense of a more they're very much technological. They have the electrokinesis, but they're still more on the mundane side as far as overall power level. They're conventional in power as opposed to cosmic, right? The nature of their power comes from convention. So then you go to the Rune. I've already mentioned the Rune before plenty of times, so you guys kind of know what they are now. They're not going to be taking over the whole galaxy. They need stuff to pillage, and they're not making anything. So, not in the same sense, right? They're more destroyers than they are creators. Gadamemter technically could, probably, but I think that falls into the Orlathrae and Resellium camp of it would take a while for him to convince, or it, I should say, because it's not really a he, it's just a fucking super intelligence. But Gadamemter would need to convince people to become Gadamemter. And if you're going to do that, that's going to take a lot of convincing because there's a lot of things to convince. Bithrantir have no aspirations to do such a thing, and I don't actually think it would be possible for them. Technologically speaking, they can outlast anybody else, but I just don't think they have the will to see it through. The Nadur Asatha, that's where you're starting to get into a different conversation, because anything that uses corpses to replenish the stocks, so to speak, that's going to be a bit more on the interesting side. I glossed over them in my answer to the Shambler's question, because I actually don't believe that the Nadur Asatha are evil. They're definitely not good, though. So, I don't know if they qualify to begin with as evil in that sense. They're definitely on the side of, questionable morals, with their resurrection and stuff. But that's an interesting angle for how they would achieve dominion over everything. And then I mentioned the Catithrons and Colopoazos. Dalventhos and Omindris are elevated in terms of their power, but not cosmic. So I would say that you'd have to discount them. And the Thrukanavot are, I think if Thruk take over the whole place, nothing changes, which is a clue, but I won't say too much more. And then if the Avo take over the whole place, I mean, that's basically the opposite of the heat death of the universe, right? Because you might as well just have another Big Bang at that point, because that's what the Avo are. They're made of energy, right? They are energy. So I think hopefully that explains it. I think the only ones that could really do it don't really have the will to do it. Like, that would be maybe the Bithrantir, or have to do it over a very long period of time, like Orthray, Roselium, Gadamemtir. And then again, the not having the will or not interested in that goal would be like Solar Throne, Bithrantir, Kolopoazos, and Katithrons. So there's the answer for 3 Crow. I like getting to talk about Xibalba. So if you guys have more Xibalba questions, definitely feel free to ask them. I don't mind talking about anything in particular, really, but it's been a while since I've had so many questions about this particular thing, because up next is our last Xibalba question, but not our last question. Lucifirius asks, in Xibalba, who are the protagonist and antagonist races? So I would assume basically by this question he means, who would you consider as like one of the central ones that does a lot of, like, I don't think that this means who has the most campaigns. It's more like, who's going to be the good guy in air quotes. So who's going to be the champion? Who's going to be the ones you can root for? And I think a lot of that times, it's going to be like Ansifi and Emberseat and Githrovin. Like, those would be 3 that immediately come to mind as ones that you would want to root for. Like, the Githrovin have good goals in mind, even if they're well-meaning in their intention. They might be a bit naive, but they're well-meaning. The Emberseat are the perennial underdogs. You always root for an underdog. The Ansifi are very relatable for humans, and what does that mean for them, right? Like, what do they really, can they wrap their heads around all the crazy shit out there? That's another reason why you might root for any of these people, but particularly the Ansifi and the Emberseat. So that would be one such example. I guess you could imagine the Psychora as a bit of a hybrid. Like, they are protagonists in the sense that they are opting to suffer in a universe that is hostile to them with, less dimensions than their bodies really need. They leave a part of themselves in their home realm when they travel here. And that is like an inordinate and impossible to imagine penalty, sacrifice, right? But also they are invading another world to pilfer its resources. Now, yes, they need that for their people back home to survive. So there's like, again, sort of like the thief that steals bread because his family needs to eat. Like, you kind of root for that guy, or you at least understand him. But I don't know if you can root for him in the same way. And that's probably where the Psychora come in, right? As far as the antagonists go, Makrel, Das, and Keltar instantly jump to the forefront here, because obviously the Makrelons are quite cunning and quite, conniving. And then you look at the Keltar, and they are just warlike to the nth degree. They take no quarter. They take no prisoners. They are very... they give no quarters, what I meant to say. They really are the kinds of, like, I guess you could imagine, like, if anybody's played Imperium Galactica 2, they might have also appeared in the other games in the setting, but the franchise. But Imperium Galactica 2 has a race called the Krahen, with one of those classic floating apostrophes for the sake of making it seem epic, lol. But the Keltar are kind of... they're not like them in all the ways, but that's one of the ways that you could imagine them. I guess another one that's probably more known to people would be similar-ish to the Krogan, I guess. I don't know that much about Krogan, and I think they became really fucking pooned or something in the latest game. I don't remember. I heard some details of them becoming very stupid, similar to like this Baldur's Gate 3 shit that's going around. By the way, Lucifirius and Alexhandr did a stream of that, so if you're interested, you should definitely ask them for a link, because that shit seems pretty funny to me. However, I would say that the Keltar just are like very much... they're these warlike people. They've united. There's reasons for them to fight each other, but it's pretty rare. Like, in that sense, you might be tempted to say, oh, they sound like, hardy people. And, they are, but, they are conquerors. These guys are like Genghis Khan or something. Like, they're here to fucking play, so watch out for them, basically. So I'll say that much. Obviously, these are all from the default regencies that you get out of retail. But they're the ones that immediately come to mind. The other ones are, I'm sure they could slot into those camps, those categories. But that's what I'll give you for now. And our final question in this section goes to Knight of the Realm, who actually is not supporting on Ko-fi, but he's a team member, and so he has access to the channel. And he asks, how do you go about deciding on unit costs? So this is an interesting tech tree question for RTSs. I think it's really interesting to think about this sort of question. I think I have this innate understanding, which is tested by repeated play from myself and many other people, of what the unit is capable of. And if it's a high variance unit, I also factor that in. Like, is it like an Acantor, where, or even a Phalanx or something, where it's like very durable and could get a lot of cost efficiency if used correctly and positioned well, but might also just blow up, right? Whereas like some units are a little bit more standard, like, you know, the Maverick or whatever. Technically, there's always context and nuance to what works and what doesn't. But you look at the context of like certain units are just very clearly a little bit more feast or famine in some ways, or can be anyway. It's more likely that you'll get a little bit or a lot of it of value out of them, depending on how the battle goes. And that makes them interesting, but also maybe a little bit more on the binary side. So you have to factor that in. Like, do you want that unit to be super expensive? Well, maybe you don't want it to be super cheap, but you also have to factor in the fact that you can stack it. Like a silly example, I guess, but the engram and the crucible, you know, together, the engram becomes a lot more powerful with the crucible. What if you have like 3 or 4 crucibles around it? Well, it becomes a fucking machine gun. So that's something that you have to worry about. And suddenly it's like, okay, well, this structure that costs a lot less than the actual value you're getting out of it once you enchant it with all this other stuff, like, it's more than the sum of its parts. And you just have to accept that that's going to be happening in certain cases. And that's fine. Like, I actually think that that's by design in many ways. So I usually start with some baseline understanding of how effective the unit is going to be in the average situation, which is why I talked about variance and like, is it going to be a feast or famine unit or whatever. Then I factor that in with availability in the tech tree. Like, is this a unit that you can get really easily? Is this a unit that you're supposed to be able to spam a lot of in order to get value out of it? Is this a unit that is very durable or not very durable? And that sort of thing. And that all plays into its power level, and as a result, its efficacy. But the tech tree availability part is also pretty significant. You know, there might be a unit that, like the Gorger Core, that's fairly expensive, but maybe isn't the most cost-efficient option past tier 1. And that's similar to kind of like the Goliath, where you probably want to replace the Goliath with some cheaper or more cost-efficient options out of something like the Mantle at tier 2.5 for Terran. But if you already have the Fulcrums or you're staying at tier 1 for a bit, it makes sense to go for Goliaths because they're very powerful at that tier relative to other units. In their cost efficiency really falls off later on into the game, and that's what's kind of interesting about that too. So I factor all of that stuff in. Did you have to pay a high premium to get access to the unit? Well, that's going to lower the cost, or at least, you know, attenuate it somewhat. And, you know, if you just were able to get it off of one structure, well, maybe it's going to be a little bit more expensive if I intend for it to be more powerful. So it comes down to like average power level and thus resource efficiency, and then you know, tech tree placement and ease of access. So those two things are really key to my understanding of what the unit cost should be. And then I actually evaluate using, you know, replays and general play myself and, you know, the micro tests that I do inside the test map and certain other things where I'm trying to see like who wins and who loses and all that. In that context, that's where I start to evaluate things. Does it feel too easy to just like a move with this one unit? After I add it, does it feel too hard to actually get any mileage out of this unit, even though it's in a context where it was designed for this role? It's just not serving that role very well. Like, these are all questions that I have to answer, and then that's how I plug in the adjustments to those costs. But I decide on the initial costs with those two metrics, and then I go into my testing, which obviously can span a very long amount of time. And I guess that's that. That is the end of our show, ladies and gentlemen. We have reached the closing mark. The welcome wagon is now peeling off into the sunset. Hopefully you are on board. I do think that there's going to be some really interesting stuff, some neat reactions to some of the tutorial content that we're going to be able to make. And, you know, I was also struck by, you know, Alexhandr's question, which again, it was much longer than what I wrote in the description for this video. It made me kind of like, why am I not making more campaigns? You know, like that was kind of my reaction. So I would love to do that more often. It's just a matter of time. And, you know, it's also hard to make campaign content when the races are still in development in terms of the raw balance, and the game mechanics weren't really fully settled on either, for that matter, like resources and stuff. It should be a little bit easier now. But even still, like, there's still more units that need to be added, particularly in the later tiers, that, who knows, that could significantly change how certain maps play or how content is then retroactively considered, right? How is it evaluated? You know, how different is your experience playing the tutorial now than it is playing the tutorial in a year when we've added a bunch of other stuff and, you know, presumably moved on from the project entirely at that point? So these would be questions that I have to ask myself. But I think it's time to just bite the bullet and get back to it. You know, it's not even really biting the bullet. It's just, it's time to fucking do it. You know, shit or get off the pot, as some people have said in the past. That would be one example of what I'm talking about here. Is I think we just pull the trigger on this and, you know, resume serious development of these sorts of things. And the tutorials are a great excuse to do it because it's something that we've needed for a long time. So stay tuned for additional development and additional progress, and of course, additional podcasts. And again, if you want my answers to your questions and you're not currently a member, or you keep forgetting to ask, well, there are solutions to both of those problems. And at least one of them involves going to Pr0totype and Week7's coffee page and donating some money, sending us some threes. Thanks everybody for your support, and I'll see you soon.